management issue where you've got pests and pathogens. The big takeaway from today, because I'm going to throw way more information at you than you can use, is critical thinking. We want to think about our plant. Most of us in this room probably have a plant that's near and dear to us that, like I definitely have a begonia addiction. There's certain plants that really I love. There's other plants, they're cool, but it's just not my thing. And so learn your plant and apply critical thinking to your plant. Think about the biological mission of your plant. So for me, as a longtime cannabis grower, obviously cannabis flower is something that we're trying to cultivate, but flowers, fruits, seeds, grains, those are all things that are beneficial to us. The plant's not doing it for us. The plant's doing it because it has a biological mission to reproduce and make the next offspring to make more apples or more cherries or whatever it might be. And so I tend to anthropomorphize, like she just said. My first pet was a fern, and so I tend to anthropomorphize plants, but really just try to keep that critical thinking hat on and think about what's the biological mission. I already got an introduction. This is me out on Maristone looking at some plants. I've been growing cannabis for 40 years. I grew up in an environment, my parents were hippies, part of the Back to the Land movement in the 70s, and so there was a lot of farming. I have a twin brother. Not a lot of direction, but we were good cheap labor, and so we did a lot of repetitive processes and that kind of thing. It wasn't really until cannabis, though, that the cultivation bug really hit me. And then I started growing everything, vegetables, cactus, succulents. I just moved here from South Carolina. I'm learning a new environment, so I'm kind of in the room with you guys as far as like I'm learning all over again. I'm kind of learning that I'm a lazy gardener because I'm spoiled from South Carolina. I could grow 10, 11 months out of the year. So if something didn't make it, that's okay. We'll plant some more and it'll be fine. So that did kind of make me a little bit spoiled and a little bit lazy. As Deborah mentioned, I did founded a hemp farm in South Carolina, got to do a lot of research, a lot of teaching opportunities doing that. And then luckily, hemp is not the best business to navigate. And so when that shut down, luckily I was able to transition to KISS. You guys obviously know Tad, the owner and founder, but these are the wonderful folks I work with, and I just wanted to plug them. Cindy runs our offices. Ben is our chief research scientist. Louisa does our marketing, and her husband Andrew does all of our warehouse stuff. And so these are the awesome people I work with, and they can help you with a lot of the topics we're going to cover today. So if in doubt, reach out to Tad, reach out to us through KISS, and hopefully we can help you. There's a ton of plants that you can fall in love with. During COVID, I think a lot of people started getting into growing, maybe people who weren't used to growing plants or people who did grow and found themselves at home with more time, started growing more, started doing propagation, started, one of the hype plants that I fell for, I don't regret it, is my albo variegated monstera. And I love this plant, and it just brings me a lot of joy aesthetically. And so plants, they smell good, they're pretty, they taste good. There's all these different things that you can appreciate about them, and there's all these other plants that you can fall in love with. This begonia, melanobalata, it's kind of like a house plant, and it needs really high humidity to be happy and to thrive. I've got some that have to stay in little terrariums and that kind of stuff. And so the big thing is just really dive into your plant, learn your plant, keep the things that we're going to look at here in a minute, they're kind of averages. It's kind of giving you some guardrails and some guidelines to go by, but it's not necessarily going to translate the exact same way to each plant, or each cultivar of a plant can express differently. We've got I think 3 different kinds of begonias and some syngoniums up here. First come, first serve. Anybody that wants to take these, you're welcome to take these on your way out. I apologize, I didn't bring enough for everybody. I think I've got 14 here, so hopefully nobody fights in the parking lot or anything. But so there's all kinds of plants that you can fall in love with, but really you want to learn your plant. And one thing that I see with a lot of folks is they come to us with problems. They don't really know what a healthy plant looks like or how it should act. And so if you've never looked at a bottom of a leaf with a scope and seen all those little water droplets coming out of the stomata, you might think you've got eggs all over the place. You don't. It's just a healthy, happy plant. And so it's just a really good idea to scout your plants, look at your plants, and get to know what your plants look like while they're healthy. My favorite plant, I just wanted to show off some of my work. If you're not familiar with cannabis, this is really good cannabis. We could go to the next slide though. So we're going to deal with a bunch of different issues because there's a bunch of different things that can happen to your plants. Again, it could be fertility. We're going to cover fertility first. That's kind of my little niche that I love. I love chemistry and I love to sit in that little fertility corner and talk about organic fertility with folks. But we're also going to talk about watering. That's the #1 reason for crop loss across all of cultivation, too much, too little. We're going to talk about pests and pathogens. But first we're going to look at nutrients. And so if you come to a plant and it's, you're not thrilled with how it looks, it's got some issue. And this one really just got a couple little brown spots, but it's a pretty healthy plant. But you look at your plant and what we're looking for is we want to have a system rather than, we don't want to guess because we could guess forever. It's like you get this weird pain and you get on Google Doc and all of a sudden you've got Ebola and a couple other things and you're in a panic. We don't want you to do that. It's wonderful now with the internet. We can get on and we can look at plants and look at symptoms and, I think I have this. You can kind of go down these wormholes or these rabbit holes endlessly. And so we want to give you a system to approach to diagnosing an issue with a plant. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a dichotomous key. Most of you have used a dichotomous key, either a naturalist book, trying to decide what flower or bird you're looking at, or high school, college biology classes. But basically it's just a series of mutually exclusive questions. You can only go one direction or the other. And so it's going to force our hand to decide, okay, well, it's not this. I have to go down this trail. And so we're not guessing. We've got a little systematic approach to force you through this matrix that will hopefully guide you to an answer. So the first thing I want to look at is, do I have a biotic issue, pests and pathogens, biotic, biology, or abiotic, which would be physical, non-biological. So if I have a biotic issue, biological issue, a pest or a pathogen, if I'm scouting regularly, and that's key, I'll notice that something weird's going over here in this part of the greenhouse. This all looks good, but there's something over here. Ooh, and there's a little bit of it over here too, and that's not great. So when you see random, not patterns, but just random areas, you want to think most likely biological. And again, scouting regularly is crucial because if you let a biological, say I've got a biological issue on this one plant, if I'm not scouting, it could spread to all these plants. 2 weeks later, I come in and I'm like, oh, it does look like a pattern. Everything's suffering. And so I'll have missed that cue, and that cue is really important. And that's going to come up again and again, that scouting is really essential. And so if I do have a pattern, and that pattern can be on a leaf, can you fold it over and it's identically, whatever the issue is similar. It could be a group of plants. It could be a particular plant, like maybe aphids like your, I don't want to say begonias, but maybe they like your begonias and something else they don't. And so you're looking for patterns, but you're looking for something uniform in a range, in a single plant, but you're looking for a pattern. If you don't see a pattern, it's biological. If you see a pattern, most likely it's either nutrients or something environmental. And this is really important for, I don't know kind of the range of what people grow here. Most houseplants, they don't put on a lot of biomass. And so they're not doing a lot of removal. So it's rarely a nutrient issue with a houseplant. It's almost always over or underwater, some sort of pest and pathogen. So if we decide that we've seen, because we're going to cover nutrients first, a pattern, we're going to look at nutrients and environment. And so Tad, if you want to go to the next thing. And again, here's that scouting that comes up, and it's really important. If you're not scouting, you won't know where your issue, you see this pattern, you're looking at it on your plant. We need to know where it started on the plant. So if you're not scouting, you can miss that. It could start at the bottom, move to the entire plant, and you're like, I don't know, it's kind of the whole plant. It's really crucial that we know where it started. And the reason why, we have mobile and immobile elements. Mobile elements, they're all mobile within the substrate, within the soil, but what we're talking about is, does the plant have the ability to translocate these elements to other areas of the plant? And this goes back to that biological mission. The apical points, that's your fruiting bodies usually, and so that's where your plant's going to give those areas the love. It's going to, it will sacrifice these bottom leaves to make sure that you can make seed or fruit. And so if it can do that, if it can translocate these mobile elements, nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium, it will. And so we'll see yellowing and different issues down here because it's trying to get, there's not enough in the plant and it's trying to move it to the reproductive areas. Immobile elements, we're going to see them at the top of the plant because they can't translocate. And so older material down here probably has plenty of boron. It's been around for a while. These apical points might not, and so we might see something up here. And then there are two elements that we could see throughout the entire plant, and those are partially mobile, and the whole plant will go chlorotic. So sulfur and molybdenum. Molybdenum, unless somebody here grows poinsettias, which I doubt, you're never going to see a molybdenum issue. But sulfur is something we do see. Luckily, the EPA cleaned up the sulfur emissions, and so we don't have acid rain, we don't have sulfur pollution, but now most of our soil, our native soils, are devoid of sufficient sulfur, and so you might see that on a plant that goes yellow across the entire plant. But so that mobile versus immobile is going to be really important. And so the first group of nutrients we're going to try to sleuth out, we've got a sick plant, we're going to assume that we see something here on the bottom, and so we're going to go to, so we're going to look, if our symptoms are at the bottom, we're going to look at our mobile elements first. So we'll look at those. And Tad, you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so mobile elements. Most folks are familiar with the front of a fertilizer bag and know NPK is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then magnesium is our fourth one. So if you see a problem at the bottom of the plant, it's one of these four. Nitrogen, a lot of these can have similar issues, so we kind of want to focus on the things that will distinguish one from another. I've got images of cannabis because that's a talk that we've given before, but I also picked three other plants. I picked begonias because it's one of my favorites. I picked calibrachoa because it's a hard one to diagnose, and then I picked sunflower because it's pretty textbook with most of the broad ranges of descriptions we're going to give. And so looking at this cannabis, with nitrogen, you're going to see lower leaf yellowing and leaf abscission. The whole leaf will just pop off. And so if you've got this, super classic lower leaf yellowing, and here it's spread up the plant because we weren't scouting. And so this looks like a sulfur issue because the whole plant's yellow. If we're not scouting and we don't see this start at the bottom, we'll misdiagnose that. And so Tad, if you'll go to the next one, we can look at some other plants. So here's, and this is why it's so important to learn your plant. So this yellowing around here, it's not particularly distinctive like it is on a cannabis plant. And if you'll go to the next one, this calibrachoa, it's more textbook where we've got the bottom of the plant showing some yellowing. And then if you'll go to the next one, the sunflower, this is really classic, lower leaf yellowing. It's all the leaves are going, and this is really severe. This plant's going to die soon. But you can see this lower leaf yellowing, and it's creeping up the plant. And so if you have lower leaf yellowing, the leaves are just popping off, leaf abscission, that's nitrogen. So if we go to the next one, phosphorus It'll also show as some chlorosis, some yellowing on the bottom, but rather than the whole leaf going yellow, you'll get necrosis, dead material here on the tips. You'll also get purpling. That's sugars, anthocyanins, and pigments. They're stacking up in the plant because the plant, if it's cold or there's not sufficient phosphorus, it can't convert those. Phosphorus is crucial for root development. A lot of us know that phosphorus is good for fruit set, but it's crucial for the entire length of the plant. Don't hold back on your phosphorus at the beginning of if you're planting new crops or anything like that. It's really important for your roots. But the real telltale sign is this leaf tip burn. So the necrosis starts on the tips and then moves in and it's lower leaf. So we'll look at some other plants. Begonia. Again, begonia is not a classic textbook example. And so one of the reasons I got into begonias is because I'd been dealing with one plant for 40 years. I needed something to push me a little. I needed a challenge. Not that cannabis is not incredibly challenging, but I'm familiar with the challenges at least. Begonias have given me a whole new set of challenges. So it's opened my brain up a lot. And, but you can see some of the yellowing. If you go to the Calibrachoa, you can see a little bit of leaf tip burn. And if you go to the sunflowers, again, it's more textbook. You've got the leaf tip burn on the lowers. That's a pretty good dead giveaway. You've got a phosphorus issue. Phosphorus for organic growers like myself is really difficult to supply. For ionic salt growers, it's pretty easy. There's not a lot of great sources for organic sources, bone meals, soft rock phosphates, and that sort of thing. And then we have to play a game with any mined materials for organics. It's going to have some heavy metals in it. Probably what you're eating if you're doing organic gardening at home is way safer than what's in the grocery store, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But just to note that phosphorus is something that you want to get out if you're doing outdoor growing. It has a triple bond. It's very hard. It takes a lot of energy to break that. And so you want to get your phosphorus out now for next year if you're doing row crops or something like that. So just something to keep in mind. Magnesium, again, lower leaf. This is the easiest to diagnose of any plant nutrient deficiency, and you get interveinal chlorosis. So between the veins goes yellow on your plant, and you can see it just classic here, and then it's progressed. So again, shows you the importance of scouting, because you might think that's nitrogen, just the whole leaf going yellow, but if you're watching, you see that it goes interveinal chlorosis first. And so magnesium is really easy to fix. 2 tablespoons of Epsom salt in a gallon of water. It should be gone in 24 to 48 hours. If it's not, call KISS. There might be something else going on. Again, begonias, you can see a little bit, but it's a lot harder to read the interveinal chlorosis on a begonia than it is on a cannabis plant with those real distinct.
I have a question. You said if you give them the Epsom salts, and you should know it in 24 hours that it's okay?
24 to 48 hours, it should start to green back up. Necrotic material will not repair. It's dead. It's gone. But yellow material, light green material should green back up. A note on magnesium and calcium. Magnesium is better as a drench. Calcium works really well as a foliar. So if we want to go to the Calibrachoa, this is, we're looking for interveinal chlorosis. There's just one kind of partial vein right here, so we're not getting that same telltale interveinal chlorosis. So again, you really want to know your plant and how it shows. Sunflower, classic, interveinal chlorosis. Early on, more advanced, but pretty easy to identify. So we've already done 3. So let's look at our 4th. Potassium, I do the bulk of the soil analysis along with Tad at KISS, and potassium is the one thing. We see thousands of soil reports, and they're all widely different. The one thing that's the same on every single one of them, everybody's short on potassium. Everybody. Potassium is strange in organics in that you need to put more out than you need to uptake in order to facilitate that uptake, and so there's some interesting chemistry that goes on there. Potassium it's going to show up as this marginal chlorosis. So you can see how it's getting light on the edges right here. It's a good one. And then on this illustration, it'll go necrotic really fast. And again, we want to scout so that we don't have a necrotic tip and think it's phosphorus. When we see these yellow margins, we know we've got a potassium issue. We can look at the begonia. And again, you know, it's showing differently. It's got the marginal necrosis happening, but it looks a lot different than the cannabis leaf. And then we can look at the calibrachoa, marginal around the edge of the leaf. It's starting to move into the interior of the leaf. And then we can look at the sunflower. And then this is more textbook, where it's starting to turn yellow on the edge. Here it's gone pretty far, and you can see the necrosis coming in. We can go to the next one. And so that's our 4 mobile elements at the bottom. And so it's pretty easy. Tiger striping, magnesium, all yellow all at once is nitrogen. Tip burn is phosphorus. And then marginal chlorosis would be potassium. So if our whole plant goes yellow all at once, it's most likely sulfur. Sulfur is really important for all of us because it's color for your flower, it's flavor for your tomatoes, it's aroma, and so sulfur is really, really important. If you have a plant that goes all yellow, you might want to look into sulfur. We can look here. This plant, again, it's not shown in the textbook, but if you are familiar with begonias, then you know that this is its way of showing all at one time. And so this plant, if you were just to walk in a room and go, what is that? If you don't know begonias, that doesn't look like the whole plant's going yellow, but that's how that shows up on a begonia. So again, you want to know your plant. Calibrachoa, this is a pretty good example right here where the whole plant's gone yellow, and then the sunflower, the whole plant's going yellow. And so that's really the only one that we worry about as far as a partially mobile. Like I mentioned, molybdenum, the only time I see a deficiency in that is with poinsettias. So now we're going to look at your immobile elements. These are all going to show at the top of your plant because they can't be translocated. And we're going to group these together. Iron and magnesium, or manganese, I'm sorry, calcium and boron, and copper and zinc. And the reason we're going to group them is because, again, we want that systematic approach. And so, bless you, if we see chlorosis at the top, yellowing at the top, we want to think iron and manganese. If we see distortion, we want to think calcium or boron and some necrosis. And then copper and zinc are usually on the most recently matured. And so not the apical point, but the set of leaves right below that fully expanded set of leaves. And so, let's see, so iron tends to go chlorotic. It can go all the way to white at the top. And so if the top, I see it in grapes a lot, but if the top of your plant is going white, then you know you've got an iron issue. And iron is a difficult element to manage because it's very pH sensitive. Like nitrogen's very temperature sensitive. You could have tons of nitrogen, it's cold. You know, we're in Washington, I'm having to learn this. It doesn't heat up to 60 degrees on Maristone until late in the season. If I put plants out, they're never going to get started. But iron is very pH sensitive. Above 6.3, 6.5, you're going to have a hard time getting it in there. So chelators in the organic world, worms, fulvic and humic acids. In the ionic salt world, there's lots of chelated iron sources that make it easy to get into your plant. On calibrachoa, you can see it's going really pale here at the top. And so that's that iron symptom. And then with the sunflower, again, it's going really pale. And the sunflower's actually got some necrosis. It's gone so far. So if we're, again, yellowing at the top of the plant, it's either going to be iron or the next one, manganese. Manganese usually shows up with a little bit of intervenal, but the real giveaway on manganese is it's going yellow, but you also get this tan flecking. It's not the reddish brown necrotic tissue that we see on the tip of this leaf right here. I don't know if you guys can see that, but right here there's some like brown red necrotic material. This right here, as opposed, is this nice kind of light tan. I shouldn't say nice, we don't want to see it, but it is this nice light tan, and it'll fleck across the leaf. And if we look at the other, you know, this is kind of more flecking. This has gone pretty far. This is more traditional, what we see in most plants. If we look at the Calibrachoa, yeah, this is really nice, this flecking. Down there too, and then real classic flecking here on the sunflower. So at the top of the plant, we either know that's iron or manganese. And so the next grouping would be calcium and boron, and that's if we've got distortion, if we've got twisting. There's some crossovers, like you can get some cupping with copper too, but you can definitely get some cupping with calcium. Calcium will usually show on the leaf tips, and calcium's interesting in that it's totally dependent on transpiration. It has to move through the xylem in your plant, so that works like a straw essentially. And so like if you've ever had to siphon some gas or something, once you get it going, it's, you know, it's pulling water through your plant. And so temperature and relative humidity, light to some extent, but they drive that. And so here in Washington State, we're cold and wet, you're going to see calcium deficiencies even with sufficient calcium. Blossom end rot on tomatoes, you know. And so you might have to put extra calcium out. You might do some foliars. But calcium is one of those that you can have sufficient calcium in your substrate and it's not getting into your plant because of environmental issues. So here's some of that edge burn that we see with calcium on the begonia. That's pretty classic, and it's nice to see on a begonia just because it doesn't always present, you know, kind of textbook. The Calibrachoa, tip burn, tip burn, tip burn. So that would make me lean towards calcium there. And then boron. Boron, you get this twisting and distortion. You can get some of that with calcium as well. But the dead giveaway with boron is you get rosetting, and it looks like a rose. That's why it's called rosetting. And what it is your internodal spaces, you know, from one node to the next. If you don't have boron, those get really, really tight, and it almost looks like a rose. And so so this is not the best example, but if we go to the next, you can see that these next sets of leaves, they're not growing up, they're just stacking on top of each other. And we can look at the Calibrachoa. Again, Calibrachoa, it's like kind of, this is typical growth. You've got this kind of long viney stem with lots of leaves. And then right here, you can see it's all kind of stacking together real tightly. And then sunflower is kind of a classic example. Like, here's the control. You can see node, 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 node. It's all just almost like a pancake. And so if it's all just stacked really tightly together at the top, really good chance you're looking at boron. A little note on trace elements. Trace elements are not composed into the plant like nitrogen or phosphorus. They are used like an enzyme or a catalyst, and so a little tiny bit is usually plenty, and we've almost always got enough just from contamination, from water, from any inputs, you know. So if you have or you suspect a trace issue, talk to an agronomist, get some assistance with that. That's math that you want to do very carefully. The worst farms I've ever seen are farms that, it's a long story and I won't tell it because I got a lot of information, but I saw a farm lose 10 acres for 8 years because they over-applied boron. Trace elements are very easy to over-apply. Trace elements at low pH can also be an issue. So if you have a very low pH, 6.3 or lower, you could have trace elements kind of getting, you know, too mobile and too available. So copper and zinc are our last two for the top of the plant. Copper, it can get confused for calcium. You'll get some telltale bronzing. This looks like iron to me, where it's, you know, you kind of lighter towards the petiole end than the leaf, so that would be easy to misdiagnose. But with copper, the thing that you're looking for, copper and zinc, remember, we're looking at the second set of leaves. This is where we're going to see the damage primarily when we're looking at copper and zinc. And so, you know, this again, begonia is hard to tell. It's just really kind of just stunted the plant more than anything. Really interesting research coming out of Utah State. Dr. Bruce Bugbee, they did some kind of copper overdoses with, they did ionic salt-fed plants as a control, and then they did organic plants. And they really ramped up the copper to where the ionic plants were dying. They were just necrotic and dead. The organic plants, because of all that material, that organic material, they're able to buffer a lot of that copper. And so they were able to take really high levels of copper, and they were getting some systemic benefit from that as far as like fungal pathogen resistance. And so that's something I'm really interested in. I moved here from South Carolina, so I moved from one fungal pathogen hotspot on the planet to another one. And so I'm very curious about that stuff. Copper, you also can get this mouse earring. It's cupping, but rather than kind of like a tacoing that you get with the calcium, this is almost like you pulled a string on and you get this little mouse ear. But again, it's not these top leaves, but it's the next set of leaves down. And then zinc is our last one. You can get some of the interveinal chlorosis, and again, it would be right here rather than here. That's my fault. That's my illustration. So I have to take credit for messing that up. But you know, again, it's on this next set down. So if you have the tiger striping on the next set down, then you would know that you have zinc. And then we'll just look at the others. These have been removed, so you can't really tell. And then again, right here, you're just seeing some chlorosis. This is showing up a little bit better as the next set down. And then this is really kind of showing at the top almost like iron. And it's just because it's gone too far, but you can see it's really affecting these leaves the next set down. And so the big takeaway from nutrients is know your plant and how it expresses. This book, Nutrient Deficiencies in Bedding Plants, that's where all of the nutrient photos came from. And it's got, do you grow peppers? Do you grow calabacoa? Do you grow, it's an incredible reference. So if you want to see what's going on with your plant, this is a great reference. So now we're going to look at disease really quick. So if it's not nutrient, it could be an integrated pest management issue. It could be a pest or a pathogen. We're going to look at a bunch of diseases pretty quickly because the big takeaway from them is they look pretty darn similar. They're going to be very hard to ID, even with a lot of experience with one particular plant. In most cases, you're going to need to do some sort of testing just to have a positive ID. And that's a real crucial thing for integrated pest management, whether it's a pest or a pathogen. Proper ID is everything. Take, for example, thrips. Thrips in cannabis 10 years ago, 75% of what we saw was western flower thrip, 25%, maybe even less, was onion thrip. So SF nematode, Steinernema feltiae nematode, was really pretty productive and would knock those thrips down. You know, it was a good control. Now we've seen a change where it's kind of reversed, where onion thrips are the primary thrip pressure, and the SF nematodes don't do a real good job of controlling them. And so getting that, you know, knowing what kind of thrip, you know, like aphids have little cornicles on their little tailpipes on their butts, and you have to like literally get a microscope and count those to get an idea of what aphid you're dealing with. So it's difficult even for trained pathologists and entomologists. So the big takeaway from these is that you're probably going to want to get some testing. Here's some alternaria leaf spot. We can look at another one. We grow a lot of peas out on Marisone, so I put this one up, and you see this necrosis. We can go to the next one. Botrytis, gray mold. This one's a little different from some of the others because you will see fluffy gray mold. This is a heartbreaker in the cannabis community because we grow like some wheat grains and that kind of stuff. We're growing this kind of tight, airy flower, and then right about the time that it harvests, the rains come in, and so it just gets wet and it stays wet. And botrytis, fusarium, pythium, powdery mildew, I've got them all on my big forehead right now. Like, they're ubiquitous. You can't get away from them, so you want to outcompete them. And a big takeaway, I just attended a webinar put on by BioWorks and Dr. Michael Brownbridge on botrytis. There is very widespread resistance to traditional chemical fungicides for fusarium, botrytis, and so they're getting better results with biology. I wish we sold these biologies at KISS. We don't. But we can advise you on some of them, and they are showing much better control of some of these fungal pathogens using biology rather than chemicals. Downy mildew, I put this one in because this is one that I see in cannabis a lot, and it's one that throws people because this is not what we think of when we talk about mildew. We're thinking something white, powdery. This is how I see it show up in cannabis. It's these light chlorotic spots. And they're almost, innocuous. You might almost pass over them. Here they've gone farther. But again, this might not be intuitive that this is mildew. And so rather than spraying just what your neighbor told you or a friend, you really want to find out what it is you have so that you apply the right biology or the right chemical. I see a lot of people waste a lot of money and a lot of heartache and lose a lot of plants misidentifying pests and pathogens. Famine foods, potatoes, nothing's immune. There's a huge number of host plants for most of these, and then there's several species of these diseases as well, these pathogens. And so, like I've got a couple of cannabis plants that are growing in a pumpkin patch that is solid white with powdery mildew. And cannabis is fine. It's some sort of species that doesn't make the jump. Now there's lots of species that will, and so the IPM nerd in me, I want to tear it all out. I want to protect my plants of value, But, this could jump to tomato back and forth, Erwinia can. And so, there's cultural controls. We don't want to do overhead watering. We want to have mulch down. That keeps blights and things like that from splashing back up on our plants. And so one of the first things I did when I moved to Washington is I installed a bunch of irrigation hoses so that I'm bottom watering and I'm not splashing anything up on my plants. And then I actually live at a house that Tad's dad owns, and he's a very avid gardener, and so we've got some hoop houses up so that we can have things like tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers covered so we don't lose all of it. We can go to the next one. Fusarium is a really big one here as well, endemic in the PNW. Fusarium, this is a great reminder that if you do lose a plant, try to look at it as an educational opportunity. I know that's not always possible, but break it open. Do you have discoloration in your xylem and phloem? Is it a root rot? Is it Phytophthora or Fusarium? This can cause crown and root rot. Pathogens, just like nutrients, are not going to show the same in every plant. And then another thing is with pathogens, if you have a plant that looks like kind of wilty today and then it's dead tomorrow, it's most likely a root pathogen that took you out. Those happen quick. We can go to the next one. Phytophthora. This is kind of a neat one. Nobody wants it, but it's kind of neat in that you can bait Phytophthora. You can take this kind of weird brown purple discoloration. This is on some tomatoes, but you could cut this section out, put it in a bag with a pear, and then after a certain number of days, that pear will have lesions if you've got Phytophthora. And so it's a way that you can actually do a test at home for free, well, for the cost of a pear, but in a baggie. But it's just kind of neat. And so do some research. There's some interesting things we can do for ourselves at home. Powdery mildew. This is what I think of when I think of powdery mildew. it's interesting. I've scoped a lot of powdery mildew, and a lot of times it almost looks like pin mold or like lacewing eggs. It'll be this this long, thin stem and then a little orb at the top. We scoped some powdery mildew at Tad's house that didn't look anything like that at all. But then a pathologist said, yeah, verified it, you know. And so to know what type of powdery mildew you have, you know, even if you know it's powdery mildew, you might want to know what type you have because it might not be a problem. And so you might not need to spend any effort or any money apply, you know. If you've got some sugar maples that look like they've been painted with milk paint and they're just white, if you're worried about some particular plant in your garden, you could get a pathologist to test that and see if it's going to jump to your plant. And then you don't have to spend the money and the heartache, you know, the time. Pseudomonas, this is one that's really, I'm familiar with from South Carolina. You can see how you get these chlorotic bands around the necrosis. This is one that will splash up and spread pretty badly. And again, the takeaway, these all look pretty similar. You know, so visually IDing pathogens, we can get a generalization. We can know that it's a pathogen, but to ID it, you really need to talk to a pathologist. Pythium, this is one that's really familiar, another root rot. It happens with young seedlings. Everything looks great, and you come back in the next day and they're all dead. That's moisture, relative humidity, and temperature. And you can see they've got a really nice substrate. Bunch of vermiculite. I don't know if there's much anything else there, but it's got good drainage. So they're trying, but something went wrong here. Most houseplant substrates, pretty chunky. Again, think about that about your plant. Where did it come from on the planet? What was its natural environment? Did it come from, you know, mountains way up in Europe or the Himalayas? Did it come from equatorial zones in the jungle? Where does your plant like to live? And so think about that in terms of its substrate, its drainage, you know, the water, air, and gas exchange and that sort of thing. In most houseplants, they want something that's going to drain really well, so a lot of aggregate in it. Rust is pretty, it's pretty devastating too, and it moves fast. You'll get these kind of like indentions, and then these pustule kind of things will grow, and you can actually see like something coming out of that. And then over here on this onion, it looks black. And so it's rust, but you wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't have known that was rust, you know, just full transparency. And so know your plant, get a pathologist involved if you really want to save some plants. This is just kind of interesting because it's a monocot. We've been looking at dicots primarily. But again, looks pretty similar to everything we've been looking at. Verticillium, this is a really bad one. Again, I see this and it looks similar to a lot of the other ones. One of the differences though is you can see this, you know, really bad vascular disease. And so cracking plants open is something I regularly ask people to do. And then Xanthomonas, just because I love strawberries and Xanthomonas also loves strawberries. And so if you have a pathogen, look at your plant, try to find out what it is, reach out to a professional, and then there should be an appropriate biological or chemical option. Watering is the elephant in the room. It's the #1 reason for crop loss across all of cultivation. It can be very confusing because the symptoms of overwatering and underwatering look the same, because in both cases you've got root death. You've either suffocated or desiccated a root tip. And so now you're seeing multiple nutrient issues all at the same time, which makes sense because nothing can come up through a dead root, and you're getting wilting, you know. And so there's a lot of tools that we can use. You know, at KISS, we sell blue mats and we do automated watering for folks because they would spend a lot of labor dollars on these big farms if they didn't have automated watering. And so there's tools that you can, you know, probes, things that you can put into your soil and see pretty accurately what your moisture level is. If you've got small plants, pick them up. What's a wet plant feel like? What's a dry plant? Like, this is wet, you know. get to know your plants. Don't be afraid to put your hands in the soil, like, feel in there. And then when it comes to containers, tall, thin containers are harder to manage in terms of irrigation compared to a short, wide container. And the analogy I usually use is like a beer glass and a Scotch glass. One's tall and thin, one's short and wide. If you put sand in both of those and then the same amount of water percentage volume, come back in 20 minutes, that beer glass, it's going to be pretty wet on the bottom, pretty dry on the top. That Scotch glass, because it's got a different surface to volume ratio, is going to be much more uniform. And so that makes, think about that when you're doing container selection. Think about what your plant wants, what type of roots it puts out. Perched water tables is something that comes up a lot. If you're putting gravel in the bottom of your pots, all you're doing is making your pot smaller. If you fill your pot up with substrate and put it on top of gravel, that's beneficial. But anytime you have two uniform homogeneous substrates come together, and it doesn't matter which one's more porous or less porous, it could be sand on top and clay on the bottom or the reverse. If you have two homogeneous surfaces that come together, you get a perched water table there. And the reason is, when you water a pot, it's not going to fill up the same way a glass does. And in our heads, it's intuitive to think that it fills from the bottom to the top because we've seen a glass fill like that our whole lives. Plants in a pot, they fill from the top to the bottom. And it might happen rapidly because we're putting in a lot of water, but there's two forces. It's not just gravity pulling the water down. Water is a polar molecule. It has a very high affinity for any solid surface. That's why you can get a little bubble of water on a water glass. It's holding on to itself. And so that capillary action wants to climb. And so you've got to get enough water so that gravity can win that fight and go down to the next level. With that in mind, pulse watering is something that you may want to do, especially with dry plants. If you go to a really dry plant and just hit it hard, a lot of that water is just going to channel and run down the sides, and it's not really going to soak that. So if you come in, hit just a little bit of water, hit everybody in the garden, and then come back and hit them again, And it's a nice way to extend your time in the garden too. But so water's everything. Water should be your PhD in the greenhouse. It should be the most experienced person. That's a waste of labor dollars, but water is everything when it comes to plants. When we were talking about those elements, three elements we didn't talk about, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We get our carbon mostly from the air, from CO2. We get our hydrogen from water. And so we think about all the time about, am I applying enough nitrogen? Think about the chemistry. Am I applying enough water? What that means is, am I applying enough hydrogen to my plant? And so you can think of it as a fertility issue. 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm chatty. I apologize. I'm a real chatty person. I'm going to blame it on Deborah's long-winded introduction. Insects, usual suspects. There's certain bugs that we see on a regular basis with a wide range of plants. Thrips, and again, there's different. Western flowers, the most common one we see. Onion thrip is really common. With mites. Two-spotted spider mite, they get the name because they've got these two spots on their back. And then aphids. Aphids have a fiercely productive reproduction strategy. They are born pregnant with viable pregnant babies, and it's really hard to slow down. So aphids, the Wizard of Oz, lions, tigers, and bears. These are my lion, tiger, and bear. And so thrips, spider mites, and aphids are the ones we see the most. If you're scouting regularly like we should be, hopefully you see damage before you see these insects. I've set a lot of alarms today. With thrips, the telltale damage, if you turn the leaf in the light, you'll see it looks silver. It looks metallic, the damage does. And it'll be these little indentations, and it flashes silver. As soon as I hear somebody say shiny or silver, I know they've got thrips. These guys, if you'll see speckling. Hopefully you see the speckling before you see webs. If you see webs, they've gotten pretty far. And then with aphids, Outdoors, aphids really don't bother me that much because I can go with a hose and just blast them off. They're not going to be able to climb back across the grass into my pot and back up. They're just going to die or eat something different. They can be incredibly hard to control indoors. They're a real problem indoors. And so the big takeaway is you want to be scouting for damage. You want to get a proper ID and not just, is it a thrip, is it a mite, is it an aphid, what kind of aphid is it, so that we get the right treatment for it. And then it's just that crucial scouting all the time. So hopefully you're out scouting, you see the damage, and you can reach out to entomologist, somebody to ID that for you, and then you can move forward. Is that the last slide? Oh, and then environmental cues. It can be, because I work for a soil company, we make soil, and we pre-charge our soil with a certain amount of nutrients. And the plant that most people are growing in our soil is cannabis, which is a very high removal rate. And so we've got a lot of fertility in our soil. But because we're fertility focused, fertility gets blamed for lots of things. So I'll have somebody call and say, hey, my plants are light bleaching. It must be the soil. Well, no, you just said they're light bleaching. It's bleaching from the light. Just, back the lights off a little. Because we're using lights that are, I don't know if these numbers will mean anything, but just a little fluorescent bulbs that your plants might be under, that's probably like 100 ppfd. Cannabis, we might be up at like 1200. So it's a lot of light. And so it might not be fertility. It might not be a pest. It might not be a pathogen. It might be that your plant's cold. Your plant might be an understory plant. A lot of the aeroids and stuff that we like to grow in the house, they are. And so maybe they're getting too much light. Maybe they're not getting enough light. Maybe it's a plant that really likes a ton of humidity. It's dropping leaves left and right. Or a prayer plant. I killed a lot of prayer plants until I figured out that they have to have distilled water. They have to, or you'll kill it. Hey, it sounds like we solved a problem. Yeah. But so that pretty much wraps up a bunch of information. We talked about fertility. We talked about proper watering. We talked about pests and pathogens. And I guess if I could add anything else, we would talk about substrate and making sure that we had that stuff right. But I've run out of time.
One quick question. You mentioned that you can call an entomologist or an agronomist, but if somebody really did want to do that, who do you call to say, other than YouTube, but?
There's county extension programs.
Okay.
There are master gardener programs.
Right.
They're sometimes good. If you ever find a really interesting bug and you get stuck, I know the best entomologist.
Yeah.
If you send me a good quality photo, I will get an identification for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's actually a really good Facebook group, Pacific Northwest Bugs, and there's a lot of really smart people in there. I've used that for spider identification before on set.
Northwest bugs.
Yeah, it's amazing. This is like, as much as cannabis, I don't know if you'll find more enthusiastic growers. There's a big gap between the enthusiasm and the skill sets and the knowledge of morphology and plant physiology. And so the forums online I don't find particularly useful because it's a bunch of people who don't know fighting with other people who don't know. But there's like the Facebook groups and things that are more professional and have some legitimacy to them, and you can find those things. And if you can't, call me and I'll point you in the right direction.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
I got a question. I'm losing my peonies. I think it's a root rot, but is there any way that?
So first thing I would do is I'd want to get I would want to be, are these I'm assuming in pots?
No.
No, they're outside?
Yeah.
Okay. So you could do some testing, some pathology testing to see exactly what's going on there. You could try to outcompete the bad actors with something like trichoderma, like a product like Root Shield WP, stands for wettable powder, but Root Shield, it's trichoderma, and it's a really aggressive biology that I apply it to my beds because I want to keep Pythium, Fusarium, Botrytis, the fungal pathogens, kind of off the table. They can really take out cannabis badly. So I would want to maybe add some trichoderma. It's always crucial to have the right plant in the right place. Sometimes a plant's just sitting in the wrong place. So if you've got a low-lying area that's just always got water, that's not the case? No? Okay. Well, a lot of these things are endemic just throughout the entire United States, not even just the PNW. And so it might be a situation where you've just got, you know, if I know I've got Fusarium, or I know I've got a blight, like I had a big, beautiful hydrangea in Charleston, South Carolina, that would just, every day at 1 o'clock, it would just drop. And it had a root pathogen. And I fought it for about 4 years. I finally pulled it out and planted something else that just wasn't susceptible. And so sometimes, you know, sometimes prune and pray, and sometimes we eventually move a plant. You know, if there's a lot of compaction, if there's, you know, some issue.
If you do have Fusarium, is that kind of permanent, or can you actually?
Kind of indefinite. There's things you want to do. You want to do mulching. You want to use productive biology, Bacillus subtilis, like a product like cease. What else? I'm blanking on some of the other products for that, like regalia. There's things that you can, you know, use to try to get around it. But if you've got Fusarium, you might want to do raised beds and mulch. You know, like Tad can't grow in the ground because of the smelters and the heavy metals out here on Fox Island.
Some people do anyway here, so I don't want to act like.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I
Well,
don't grow my edibles in the ground because I'm worried about it. I have a 4-year-old. But one thing I did want to mention, because a lot of the pests that you can talk about, like spider mites, thrips. I mean, even powdery mildew. Some people will use like a neem oil. You know, you hear people recommending that. There's the one thing about neem oil is we have seen it get hit with like pesticides. So like if that neem tree had pesticides applied to it in India, those can end up in the oil, concentrated in the oil. And we've had people fail for pesticide testing for pesticides that have been illegal in the U.S. for
decades.
30, 40 years. So what one good option is an alternative to neem oil, and it works for a pretty wide range of diseases and pests, is mineral oil, which Monterey Garden horticultural oil. You can buy it on Amazon or at Home Depot for under $20, and that's probably my best like go-to spray if I don't know what I'm dealing with. You're not going to get a lot of phytotoxicity, and it's generally pretty. It has a good mode of action because it smothers or suffocates the pest rather than some of the fungicides and pesticides where the pests can develop a chemical resistance to it.
Another note on that.
Monterey horticultural oil.
A note on Monterey. Monterey and Suff oil are the same thing. I like to tank mix if I'm up against a serious pest issue with Botanigard WP. It's a Bovaria product, and so you'll get the knockdown from the oil. It's a suffocant. Disrupts feeding, kind of glues them in place. They starve and die. It suffocates them. So, but as soon as it's dry, it's lost all of the efficacy for pests. One nice thing about oils is it does work like a leaf shine, like a leaf coat, and so it can help with like powdery mildew and some of the other things. It can't get to the cuticle. It can't get through the oil layer, so that can be nice. But tank mixing that along with Bovaria is a really good way to knock down pests. If you spray oils, this is counterintuitive, and I see people get into trouble with this. Tad said I've sprayed oil at 120 degrees in Charleston, South Carolina, and no phytotoxicity. If you spray it at the end of the day or very early in the day, and it takes more than 3 or 4 hours to dry, you can get some phytotoxicity. So we've all probably burned a plant with soap, spraying it in the heat of the day. And so we're scared to do that. Oil really needs to go on in the heat of the day. You want it to dry fast.
One other thing I learned about soaps from an entomologist is insecticidal soaps is actually a different carbon chain than Dr. Bronner's or Dawn soap or these types of soaps, so it's going to be more effective. And like Brandon said, those you want to spray in the morning, whereas the oils you want to spray during the heat of the day.
So much to know.
Actually, I really like the idea of pH testing the soil and testing for minerals.
Yep.
We've been on a larger scale. We have about 1.5 acres just across the bridge, and we've been losing trees. And so we've had pretty much one tree a year that are 200-year-old trees
Oh,
drop off, including Madrona, Douglas fir. So we have a arborist company that's come out, and they've just recently started testing the soils and whatnot too, and have found that some of the trees are also deficient in in minerals and sugars. And I mean, it's a whole new world for me. I mean, I don't really think about having to take care of a Douglas
tree,
fir.
right,
you know?
right.
It's just really kind of strange. Or they were saying that the western cedars that we have on the property are drying up. We don't have enough water because of climate change. So they were suggesting that I water the trees 10 hours a week, and I'm just like with a hose, an acre, like
right,
it's not gonna happen.
right.
And then the fungus has been a huge problem. They've had to close down Kopachuk Park here because the trees were just falling over, and I can speak to that. We've got the same fungal problem. We just lost a huge, beautiful Madrona, just dropped right over, and the fungus that they said was in the tree is the same type of fungus that caused the potato blight back in the day in Ireland. So it's just a slight variation of that. So I guess if there's a question, and I'm going to try to feed the trees now, how would you suggest going about doing that? There's a lot of trees.
Yeah, and so you need to pick a fiscally responsible path to try to combat that. Sometimes, like I'm from Appalachia, and you think of elm trees and these giant, just monsters of the forest. You can drive for miles and they're all dead from the elm borer. And so
Yeah, we've got the boring beetle.
yeah,
This is knocking the trees out.
so sometimes there's nothing you can do. Sometimes you can band a tree with glue and things like that. As far as feeding a large area, that's something that Tad's dad and I talk about a lot. And manures, composts, those are probably your best bang for your buck. Kelp is really cheap usually. It can bring in some enzymes and some micros that if you bring it off the beach, just rinse all the salt, sodium and chloride off of it. And then you can dry it out, chop it up and spray it everywhere. But probably compost, dairy wash, manure, things like that is probably going to be the best bang for your buck because it's expensive to feed a large area. And especially in Washington where we get all this rain, and so if you're putting out nitrates, they're just, you want to kind of spoon feed that throughout the season. An indoor cannabis grower, I put most of my fertility in as a one-time pre-plant, application. For something like that, I would want to get, multiple rounds maybe.
And we've treated the boring beetles. They drill into the tree all the way around, and then they apply a pheromone. So the boring beetles think, oh, this is a competitive boring beetle, and
I'll go
they
elsewhere.
flee.
Yeah.
But they go, of course, into another tree. So it's whack-a-mole.
Yeah. But it is really interesting that we are looking at all these biological solutions because we have over-applied, like there's two types of Botanigard. There's one Bovaria that's just Bovaria, and then there's Botanigard Max. Botanigard Max has pyrethrins in it. You can use that one time for a knockdown. If you use that all the time, if you're tank mixing those pyrethrins on a regular basis, you're in big trouble because you're breeding pyrethrin-resistant aphids, and Don't call me.
Ladybugs.
No, that brings up a great point. So beneficial insects, ladybugs, that's one that I did for years, for decades, not even years, for decades. I think it's one that we all like. Everybody likes a ladybug. It's nice to see ladybugs in the garden. The problem with this job is that I know too much now. And so when I see a ladybug, I don't go, oh, cool. I'm like, oh, crap, what's it eating? What's it here for? It's here for something. It's not here for the view. It could land anywhere, so it wants to eat something. Ladybugs, most of the ones that are sold are not native, and the ones that are over-harvested. And so the message that entomologists want people like me and Tad to get out is there's better insects that can be reared in a lab that will be more effective. Ladybugs typically just take off.
Yeah.
You know, they just disappear. And so just the message would be that, you know, there's a better solution than ladybugs out there.
I just want to add, there are things like like you mentioned, beneficial nematodes. Those can treat fleas in your garden, in your lawn, for example.
Yep.
Or he was talking about Bavaria. That's a specific microbe that you can purchase that will attack the insect and damage it. There's other ones that will disrupt their feeding cycle. So insects can't develop a resistance to being eaten is one of the things entomologists like to say. So there are cases where purchasing beneficial insects is really great, but with the ladybugs, unfortunately, it's just kind of like the dark side of the bug industry that people don't know about, because I know I didn't know about it either. And so you can actually spread diseases so even though it's the same species coming out of California, it can spread diseases to the native populations of ladybugs around here. So attracting ladybugs is a really great option, but we want to discourage purchasing it. And you can literally go on Google and type in "do not buy ladybugs" and read all about it.
Yep.
Or I did a whole podcast with a ladybug expert if you want to hear an hour about ladybugs, but that's a lot.
This book, if you are a bug nerd and you really, really, really love insects, this Coppert book it's expensive. Don't get the Japanese version, because I know one guy that ordered it and he didn't check and he got the Japanese version, and so it's really interesting because it's backwards, but it's for us. It's pretty. It's got great pictures, but he can't read anything. But this book has pests and pathogens, and it's knowing and recognizing. It's by Coppert, Koppert, and this is one of my desert island books. This is for, when it comes to bugs, this is better than anything on the internet for me. And it's a real resource. It talks about who their natural predators are. You know, like Tad said, you can't build up a resistance to somebody eating you. And even with the oils, you know, Tad said he's got the best entomologist. I don't know her the same way, but I've talked to her several times, and we're friendly. And one of the conversations we had one time, I was talking about I love oils because you can't build resistance to suffocating. And she went, well, and I was like, no, how? And there's a type of scale that has built up a resistance to suffocation. And so I don't remember the methodology of, you know, it holds its breath. Can't remember what it does, but it's fairly resistant to suffocating. And so changing your MOAs, your modes of action, is really important. And you know, not over applying, you know, changing things up so there's not resistance is important.